All right, so hi everyone. My name is Julia Guimond, and I'm a member of H3S, or the Hydrology Section Student Subcommittee. Thanks for joining us today for the second CUAHSI H3S Cyber Seminar series. If you were around last week, we talked about the pre-application, sort of when to start looking and where to look. So this week, we're going to actually talk about the application phase, more about the application materials, the application process, as well as the interview process. So a lot to cover in one cyber seminar. Similar to last week, we'll have our panelists introduce themselves. You can see them up on the screen. So a few folks joining us from last week, as well as a few new folks. And then we have a few questions to get things started, but we're really looking to the attendees to send in their questions. So there's a chat box or a question box on the toolbar. And so at any point in time, feel free to send in your questions, and we'll get to those in the second half of the seminar. So with that, I think we should get started since we have so much to cover. And so I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and sort of their current position, and then answer the two questions that we have for them, the two initial questions. So were there parts of strictly the application phase that caught you off guard or that you hadn't prepared for? And then the second question being, is there anything you'd wish you'd known going into the application phase, or anything you would have done differently? So with that, I'll pass it to Dr. Joanna Blaschek to start us off.
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. So I am a new assistant professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. And in terms of what caught me off guard, I spoke to this a little bit last week, but it takes a lot of time to prepare for these job materials, and it takes a lot of reading and reaching out to others. And so as we'll talk about moving forward, I really leaned on my network, but as well as Google, to find a lot of documents that help me sort of not get caught off guard in the middle of interviewing. So I guess we'll touch on where to find those resources in a little while, but yeah, that's it.
Awesome, thanks. Dr. Barnard?
Hi, this is Theo Barnhart. I'm a physical scientist at the U.S. Geological Survey's Wyoming-Montana Water Science Center up in Helena, Montana, which I realize is kind of a nebulous description, but basically I work on the National Hydrologic Model and do some geospatial development. Man, what caught me off guard, I think, was, so I've mostly applied to federal jobs, and I think the first one I did was for the USGS, and once I'd run the gauntlet through USA Jobs, you kind of get spit out into another, like monster.com-esque job application website, and there's a whole new slew of things to answer that aren't exactly explained from the job posting. And so that kind of, the first time around, that really caught me by surprise. And you're trying to do your best on those. And then if I could do things differently, I think I would, I would really look pretty closely at the job series that I was applying for, because those have a lot of related qualifications that may not seem that important, but, the hiring managers really do focus in on those. So you can save yourself a lot of work by cutting out things that you're not already pre-qualified for.
Great, thanks. Dr. Ali Mohammed?
Hi, everyone. My name is Hamid Ali Mohammed. I'm the Chief Data Scientist at Radiant Earth Foundation, and happy to be here, and thanks for the organizers for inviting me. I think one of the things that I would have done differently if it was now that I would go through the application process was being more proactive with the applications. In connection to what just Theo mentioned, when I was looking at the job descriptions, I would basically look at the qualifications and the skills they're looking for. And if it wasn't a 100% match with my background and resume, I would say, okay, I don't apply for this job. But now that I'm in a position I'm hiring, I'm like, okay, even if someone is 50% match, I'm going to interview them and to see how they have done in their previous position and how they can potentially adapt to the new role and the skill set. So I would be more comfortable to apply to positions even if I have a 50% match with the skill set now, and if I'm happy to basically move to a new role and learn new skills and be flexible with that. So that is one of the things I would definitely do different if I started now.
Awesome. These are so great. Dr. McDonough?
Hi there, it's Jeff McDonald here. I'm a professor of hydrology and associate director of Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. I was at Oregon State University for many years prior to moving back to Canada. And I guess maybe I'll reflect not so much on my experience, because 30 years ago, it was before the internet was invented, and this whole process was rather different. But you know, over these last 30 years, I've had maybe, I don't know, 50 or 60 PhD students and postdocs, and kind of watched them through their application phase. And perhaps one of the things that catches students off guard is that, especially as time goes on, there are a lot of applications for jobs. And as someone who's sat on maybe, I don't know, 50 search committees, and each one is getting, let's say, 100 applicants, the need to have highly condensed material, especially to make it through that first round. So for instance, a cover letter, my own recommendation is to keep it a page maximum. Why? Because a poor faculty member on that search committee is going to be looking at 100 of them along with the related materials. And I think to be able to communicate what you do in a condensed way is so crucial. And to know, I guess, also that those 100 applicants are all going to have a few good papers out of their PhD. So what is it for an academic application I'm talking about? You know, what is it that lets you stand apart from the pack? Being involved in this in the student subcommittee of AGU, that's a great example. Maybe you're involved in a session organization. What kind of extracurricular activities have you done that show leadership-like qualities? I had no clue of that when I applied for a job, and those maybe are the things that kind of caught me off guard. Maybe one other thing in terms of doing differently, I think something that I've seen in my own students and we talk about in our group meetings is when you read the ad, knowing what's required and what's desired. These are specified, and these are often painful discussions by the search committee along with groups across campus to define what are the required and desired qualifications. You must meet those required qualifications. So each application is kind of you're redefining yourself almost. So going narrow rather than sending out 50 applications, at least in the academic world, is a very good way to go. That may be different in the consulting world, and maybe we can talk about that later. But I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thank you. That was really helpful, and we already have some really good questions coming in. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a few more people joining. Feel free to send questions in at any point. So with that, we'll sort of start the question process, and along the lines, some of you touched on this already, but what were the resources that you leaned on the most to prepare application materials, like the research, teaching, diversity statements, or changing a CV into a resume, depending on academic or non-academic? And so was this offered by your university, your lab group, your advisor? So, you know, any of the panelists can jump in at any point, I think. And if you feel like you have an answer or some insight on these questions.
Well, I can start. So I can only speak for academic positions, but basically halfway through my PhD, I started to realize that I did want to pursue an academic position. So I started looking for resources. And one of those that I found was this book called The Professor is In. And it's geared towards social scientists, but I still found it incredibly helpful to read. And so if for those of you out there who are interested in academic positions, I can't say this strongly enough that as soon as you start to think that that might be something you might want to pursue, I would start Googling things, start reading blog posts, try to find books and other resources that really talk about what is it that those search committees are looking for, just as Dr. McDonald was saying. So leadership. I've also, something that kind of caught me off guard was that sometimes in different PhD programs, they stress that maybe teaching isn't your #1 priority. But I found through conversations that sometimes having that checkbox of I taught a class independently can help your application quite a bit. And as for other resources, I also, again, leaned on my network. So I tried to reach out to former lab mates that were now in academic positions, and I asked them if they would be willing to share their job documents with me. And then I also spent quite a bit of time just thinking through what sort of research program would I want to pursue, and what have I already either have already contributed to or planning to contribute to, so that I would be able to demonstrate in my job applications that I am able to put out publications regarding the topics that I'm interested in. And then finally, once I had a pretty complete draft of those job documents, I asked for feedback from my PhD advisor, from my postdoc advisor, just to really make sure that the documents were mine and my research interests, but then still trying to get their feedback on how can I improve those, how can I clarify and condense what it was that I was trying to say. So that was my process of trying to put together applications.
Yeah, one of the things I found very useful, particularly being at the university, was the career development centers and writing center at the university. So I basically made an appointment. I had a one-on-one meeting with one of their staff who would review your resume or CV and give you feedback on what to include, what not to include. Particularly if you're preparing a CV or resume, they can help you with the differentiation between those two. And then also having a kind of a mock interview with them. So they would spend like half an hour to 45 minutes doing more of a behavioral interview, because they're not necessarily technical people to conduct a technical interview, but they help you get acquainted with the environment of an interview when you're doing particularly either a phone interview for the kind of a screening phase or an in-person on-site interview. Those were very helpful at the beginning of the process. And then definitely, as Joanna mentioned, talking to your peers and others in the community who have been through that process and are now in those positions, and getting their feedback. I reached out to my network, people who were in that company that I was applying, or in others, and tried to get their feedback about how did it, what was that took them off guard, what did they learn through the process, and if I knew someone at that specific company was applying to, get their feedback about what this position is looking for. Because particularly on the resume and the cover letter, you need to include highlights of your work. So you can fine-tune that with some keywords that is more matched to the position they're looking for. And this is something that might be different. I want to mention this between, if you're particularly applying for non-academic positions that I'm talking to, between a big company and a small company. So big companies have recruiters who usually look at the resume first. And then small companies, usually there's no recruiter, it goes to the hiring manager or a technical person to review this. So you need to make sure you really have the highlights of what that position is looking for in your cover letter, particularly if a recruiter is looking at those, because they spend like maybe 1 minute on the cover letter and the resume to decide, okay, if I should move ahead with a phone screening or not. They receive hundreds of applicants, as Jeffrey also mentioned. It's the same in the industry, and they need to see the highlight in the first look. So you need to be very concise, be very selective in what you put there, but put the best of your experience and background in a one-page cover letter and 1 to 2 page resume, particularly for industry positions.
Yeah, these are good points, Jeff. Here again, you know, and maybe the equivalent on the academic application is in that letter speaking to how you meet those required and desired qualifications. I think the point about getting hold of successful examples from your network is very, very useful. There's a new faculty member, John Duncan at Penn State University. He was very kind in lending some of his materials to 1 or 2 of my students. Boy, that made such a difference for them to see what a winning example might be. 2 other small things. One, in terms of condensing, there's a great new book by Randy Olson called Houston, We Have a Narrative. And he was a tenured professor at New Hampshire, went to Hollywood to become a screenplay writer, and now this is his 2nd book talking to academics about communication. And he talks about the and, but, therefore approach to communicating what you do. I think this is something I've only recently learned of, but it's a game changer potentially for how you can condense all of what you do into a short letter that's attention grabbing. So Randy Olson, Houston, We Have a Narrative. Maybe the last thing is really get to know the department and how you would link or fit or connect. I think those that make that, paint that picture really in the cover letter with enough detail where your research, who it links with some specificity. You need to be careful because you want to do it in a very a way that ingratiates you to the department and doesn't exclude anyone or any groups, but really shows how you've thought about what the department's all about and how your role would kind of complement and extend and augment what's there. These are things I think that can be really helpful in that application phase.
This is Theo. I'll just echo the reaching out, to your network. I did that a lot when I was applying to these, U.S. government jobs, in that they didn't really fit the academic mold. But luckily there was a postdoc who had recently been hired by the USGS that came out of the same lab that I did. And I had some friends who had similarly gotten hired into federal positions, and they gave some pretty nice, tips and tricks for, squeezing all that, we do as, academics, either, coming out of your PhD or postdoc and going into this kind of, juggernaut that is the federal government, and how you can, append cover letters onto your, resume or CV that you upload, how you can answer, questions so that you can, make sure your materials are actually seen by someone in the office that's doing the hiring, that they don't get kind of filtered out during the initial screenings. And then I'll also echo, it's important to do the legwork to really get your name, in the minds of the people that are doing the hiring, and that is often not clear from the job postings. So you kind of have to do some digging through the different center directories to figure out who you actually need to talk to. But I thought that was pretty helpful.
Oh, that's perfect. One of the questions was specifically to you, Theo, about if you contacted the hiring manager and if that was helpful. So it sounds like there's a little background work that needs to be done in terms of, rather than just contact a said person.
Yeah, and the hiring manager that's listed is often, that's just, that's someone who works in HR, probably in Denver or in Sacramento, and they're not actually the person who's going to be, looking at all the resumes that actually float to the top of the application pool. So figuring out who kind of if you were to be hired, who your supervisor would be or who your coworkers would be are kind of the things you have to do to figure out who to actually talk to.
Great. And then sort of building on what Dr. McDonald said, you discussed adding in extracurricular activities. Where in the application is best to do this? So there's the research and teaching statement can incorporate a little bit, but where's the best location within this package to really highlight some of your leadership roles?
If you're asking me just quickly, I'd put it in the cover letter, just because many applications, they won't get to your teaching and research statements, sad to say. If the cover letter and the resume don't seem to measure up, that's really your first point of entry, I think, the cover letter. Others might have different views on that, but that would be my inclination.
All right. So this is getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty. We have a lot of questions coming in. Just talking specifically about the research statement and sort of the balance between what you've done and what you hope to do. Would you guys want to talk about sort of, what you think the delivery of the research statement and sort of that happy balance between the present and the hopeful future?
Sure, I can start. So again, only speaking for academic positions here, but for each application, I spent a couple of hours on the application, making sure that it was tailored to the position and to the university. So part of that process was taking what I had written before I even really started applying to jobs, and then thinking about what were the funding sources that I might pursue, who are the stakeholders that I might try to interact with, and what are some of the more regional issues that I might try to address with my work. So my research statement had sort of an introduction, 3 main sections, and then a short conclusion. It was 2 pages. And then within each of those 3 sections in the middle that were really the meat of the research statement, I had a paragraph where I would sort of discuss what contributions I had already made during my dissertation and my postdoc, and then I would always have this paragraph at the end of each section that was kind of tailored to each position. So what skills, what ideas was I going to take from that previous work and then apply moving forward? And so I would try to tailor that a little bit for each one.
Great, that's really helpful.
I think having themes that your research can map to, having a research brand identity for an academic position that your maybe 2 or 3 pieces connect to is very helpful. Making it clear that you're working on important problems, not trivial problems. And if these problems map to an area of strategic investment at the university you're applying to, that's an extra bonus. All of these materials will be on the web, their 5-year plan or 10-year plan for the university, their mission, their vision. Often they'll communicate 3 or 4 or 5 areas of strategic investment. Could you make a nod to that in your application as you tailor it for that job opportunity or job ad? And then I guess anticipating that if you do get the interview, you might be asked, in fact, you probably will be, what will be your first grant proposal? Who are you going to send it to? What will you be asking for? They're going to get down to that level of specificity in some of your interactions, most likely. And kind of thinking that through as you work up your application documents, your research statement can be a helpful exercise as well.
Great, I had not thought about some of those things, so thank you. transitioning a little away from the academic side of things. Sorry about that. How to recruiters, do you consider PhD education as job experience? And along that lines, is it okay coming out of your education applying for some of these jobs that require 3 to 5 years of experience?
I can speak to that. I would say generally yes. You have a PhD education, particularly because you're doing a research experiment there. It's not just like taking classes, right? So that is really a professional experience, and that's what I would name it on the resume, a section called professional experience. And then you say, okay, I was a graduate research assistant, and I did X, Y, and Z. That is really considered a professional experience. If the position really requires skills that is not research oriented, they might look at it differently, but generally that is considered an experience. So if the job description says 3 to 5 years of kind of professional experience, I would go ahead and apply for that position if I have a PhD with that number of years of experience, definitely. And something to include in there is, so when you talk about your professional experience and you say, okay, I was at this university, this was my research, and I did X, Y, and Z. When you're talking about those things, you need to use what sometimes the career development office people call it action verbs. For example, if you have done a modeling study, don't say I studied this. Use a verb, say, for example, I modeled this, I implemented something. I designed and modeled X, Y, and Z. Use those action verbs to explicitly explain what you have done. And then talking about that project or research experiment, use keywords that would be more familiar to the person looking for an employee, for the recruiter or the technical hiring manager. Because as I said, they only skim through this resume very quickly. So they need to see those keywords and then say, okay, this person matches my filter. Now I want to do a more in-depth interview with them. That is very helpful. The other part is, particularly for industry positions, at the very top of your resume, include a 3 to 4 line summary. And just talk about your experience, what you have done, and what are you looking for. It's very hard to summarize everything to 3 to 4 lines, but that is very helpful in general, particularly if a recruiter is looking at your resume. So include your experience there, talk about the things that you have done, use the kind of skill sets you have learned or you have basically taken courses on, and then say what are you looking for in terms of a position that you're applying to. That is really helpful usually from a hiring perspective when we are looking at the resume.
Okay,
Yeah,
and then, oh, go ahead, please, sorry.
Oh, sorry, this is Theo. I'll just echo that I totally agree with Hamid's, advice to translate kind of the academic jargon into, more industry level things. Like I know here we really value, completing things on time. Our deadlines are a little more firm than in academia maybe sometimes, and so really being able to like show that you can, produce the right things on time is like a nice thing to include.
Great. And so to follow up on that, people are curious, the audience is curious about whether or not to include publications in non-academic job applications. So how much really to focus on that part, which is huge in academia, but maybe not the center of attention outside.
Yes, that's true. I would say included, but not the like the extensive list of if you have 20 publications and presentations, everything there. Put the selected publication list that is really related to the position you're applying to, because usually these positions have a kind of limited scope compared to the research experience you might have in a PhD. So put the title of that section, selected publication, so they know also this is selected, this is not everything. but just put the very top ones that are related to the position. Sometimes there are positions that are very much engineering and software oriented. So let's say you have worked on a hydrologic modeling experience and you have a very good software skill set and you're applying for a software position, which is in a geospatial domain. Those will be more looking at your skill set in the software side, not necessarily, for example, research side. So papers might not be that much important in that kind of application. For those, it is really not a priority, I would say. If you have room in a 1 or 2 page resume, yes, include it. But otherwise, if the position is very much on a developer software side of the story, yeah, don't prioritize it. Yeah, that would be my comment on this.
I would say include it from the from the federal side. Writing proposals, writing reports, writing publications, giving presentations are all kind of very important skills that we use. So having a good publication record, I think really both, journal publications and, conference presentations, those are also kind of our currency as well, but maybe in a slightly different format. So I would say if there's room to put those in, I would put them in, because that really demonstrates that, you can deliver deliverables.
One thing I will add here is if you have an online profile of your publications, whether it's a Google Scholar, a ResearchGate, a personal website on the university domain, or any other website you have for yourself and you're summarizing all of these, put the URL in the resume, definitely. And make it a clickable URL so they can easily click on it and go to that website and scroll your experience and publication. That is also very helpful.
Okay. So I sort of want to transition more to the interview side of things. So part of the application process is the actual materials, but then thinking more, you get past that first step and you're on campus. And so either in non-academic realm, were there any questions that you didn't expect, or were there any trick questions? And then in during academic interviews, really, what did you talk about with all the people that you met? You spend multiple days on campus, and how do you connect with people that are really outside your knowledge realm or your comfort zone?
I can start with the academic side, especially since I went through this process last year, fresh in my memory. So before you even begin to think about what you're going to talk about on campus, I would really stress that it's very important to prepare for the phone, meaning Skype interview, because that is, I think, one of the most challenging parts, actually, of the entire application process. You have about 25 to 30 minutes to respond to a series of questions that you don't know ahead of time in a concise and convincing manner. And I think that a lot of people that I know, that has been the sort of major hurdle, and oftentimes people go through a couple of phone interviews before they get invited to an on-campus interview. And so to find, and through preparing for those phone interview questions, you are also preparing for the on-campus interview, because many of those same questions will come up while you're on campus. But as for the types of questions, I think Jeff touched on this earlier, where one of the sorts of questions you might be asked is, if you were, what would be your first proposal? Who would you send it to? What question would it be, and how would you tackle that question? And other questions that I received were more related to the fit of the department. So I tried to stress my answers ways in which I would complement existing expertise. And then there was always one question about teaching. So what sort of classes would I be willing to teach? And maybe what are some courses that I might develop? And so for that, I definitely tried to make sure ahead of the interview to look at what was already being offered and to think about, kind of try to read their minds a little bit. What is it exactly that they're looking for? And probably what are the classes that you would be expected to teach, so you can say that you've already seen that there's a course that kind of fits your job description. And I think that shows the hiring committee that you're invested in this job application and that you have really taken the time to get to know them. So basically with the whole interview process, you know, it's an awkward process, right? You're trying to get to know people really quickly and they're trying to get to know you and decide, are you a colleague that they're going to want to spend a lot of time with in the future? And the best way to alleviate that awkwardness and to kind of let people relax is to prepare as much as you can. So I know, just the last thing I want to say is I know that I did a lot of Googling of different PDFs and different blog posts, again, on what are typical academic interview questions. And ahead of the phone interview, I tried to prepare short, just 2 to 3 minute answers to a wide variety of questions. And then during that phone interview, I had a little note sheet with me, especially when it came to potential funding agencies and potential local stakeholders. And I was just totally open, and I would say, oh, I have some notes here about these are people I would want to reach out to, or organizations that I would want to reach out to. So the biggest thing I can say, right, is just read, and prepare as much as you can. And there's a lot of resources out there to help you.
Maybe I could continue on the academic interview side. You know, it's really is like a personality contest when the 3 people are brought in for interview. I would say sitting on the other side of the desk for many hires, meaning on the hiring committee, we really don't have strong feelings about which one we might hire. So it's quite a bit a personality contest, a fit, like we just heard. It's also an endurance event. If you're on campus for 2 days, there are breakfasts, there are lunches and dinners, there's meetings on the hour, sometimes on the half hour. You're meeting with grad students, a dean, colleagues, the search committee. So it's you know, simple things like getting sleep, feeling on top of things when you get there, because it is going to be an endurance event. My colleague at the Colorado School of Mines, Kamini Singha, she's got a great phrase for what the interview boils down to. And she says, you must sparkle. I think that's a great way of describing what the interview is all about. You've got to sparkle for the search committee with, you know, exciting research questions, collegiality, leadership. And yeah, I agree. You know, is this someone you're going to enjoy spending time with as a colleague for the next few decades? The way you connect with people, I think, particularly if they're in a research area that's a bit askew to what you do, ask them questions. And I think that's a way to maybe break the ice in a faculty member's office if you've got 30 minutes scheduled with someone you really, you know, don't share too much commonality. The key thing though is that you ask questions and don't sit there. you really want to engage, just showing that you would be interested in collaborations. Many positions now are really focusing on interdisciplinarity. These are ways to think about connections between you know, you and a would-be colleague. The last thing I'll mention, I guess, are some of the surprise questions you could get. My first job interview was at Utah State University a long time ago, and the dean, Thaddeus Box was his name, I went to his office, and his first question in this real Texas drawl was, so who's your hero? So that really caught me off guard. Who's my hero? Well, I'd been on a long flight from New Zealand where I'd done my PhD. All I could think of was Wayne Gretzky. And this follow-up question was, what book are you currently reading? And, you know, I was on some crazy Shirley MacLaine Eastern mysticism reading kick and told him that title. I don't know how I got the job, and I actually was a professor there for a number of years. And it was funny because after being there, other faculty members told me he'd asked them the same question. And of course, they had much more sophisticated answers than me. So just be aware of completely off the wall questions. And of course, what they're trying to suss out is, what kind of person are you? Are you completely one dimensional, or do you have extracurricular activities? Are you interesting? You know, they're trying to hire a quality person. So don't be afraid to, you know, weave in some of the, you know, not the work extracurricular activities, but, you know, other things in your life that could help to paint you in a way that would make you a colleague that they would value and appreciate.
And can I just quickly jump in on an extra tip, especially on the note of the endurance event, is that something that really helped me was coming with a notebook. And on the second day, at the end of the day, I am just wiped out. I've talked to everyone about everything I could possibly think to ask, but I still had my notebook, which I had written down some pre-prepared questions, and that really helped me sort of get through those final interviews. I know that at one of the schools that I interviewed at, I met with, I think, 35 different people. So there's a lot of preparation going into that, and it can really drain you, but try to think of ways that you can help yourself out before you even get there.
So on the industry side, there's a lot of similarities with the academic interview process that it was just explained. The on-site interview is usually shorter, so the process usually starts with the phone interview. For that, always be ready to explain your background and experience in 3 to 4 minutes. So usually the first question is, okay, just explain what you have done, what are you looking for in a couple of minutes. So have that content ready in your mind. Practice it probably with a peer or a friend to do it over the phone, so you're ready to explain yourself. Then when you're on site, I mean, one thing I want to add to what Joanna and Jeff just mentioned is be yourself. Yes, they are definitely looking at the cultural fit, and it's the same in industry. They want to see, okay, are you a good colleague? Can you be a good match with the existing teams? And you should be yourself. Just explain yourself the way you are. Yes, be prepared to answer all the questions, but be yourself. And one other thing I add is that also have questions in mind to ask them, because the interview process is also 20% you interviewing them to see if you want to go there. Yes, you have done your research, you know they're a good place to go, but you want to also take some questions, particularly when you're in an industry job application. You want to know what is the culture inside the company. Where are they going in 5 years? What is their growth rate? If there's any funding situation, if there's any, I don't know, block down the road that might be a trouble and you don't want to go through that process. So have some questions in mind to ask the people you are meeting, whether it's the people in the team that you will be joining or people outside of the team. Because when you're on site, particularly with bigger companies and organizations, you will also meet with people outside of the team that you will be joining. There might be also like casual, like lunch or dinner meetings, all of them in one day, as I mentioned. So have some questions ready to ask them, and that will be also giving you some feedback. The same way as academic jobs in the industry, you apply to multiple positions, and sometimes you're traveling a lot during a very short time period. So that will also make you tired. One thing I want to add here is also make sure you are mentally and physically fresh. Exercise during that process. Make sure you have good sleep, particularly if you have like jet lag and traveling a lot. Make sure when you go to those meetings, you're fresh and ready to answer and be yourself.
I'll echo that, you know, on the government side, it's a pretty short process in terms of interviews. I think I was given, so, you know, full disclosure, I only went through one of these, and I got lucky on the first try, and that, you know, the first job I applied to, that's what I'm in. and that was also a student internship job that, you know, they essentially have these career pathways where once you're in one of these internships, you can, you know, move on to the federal, like to becoming a full employee once you're graduated. So the interview process was actually pretty short. I think it was a 1-hour phone interview, no video conferencing, nothing. And I was given about 24 hours notice. So I didn't have a ton of time to prepare, but, and I think that reflects that there's not a ton of budget for the actual hiring process on our side. And maybe that's different for, you know, much higher level positions. But I think most of the positions that, you know, a master's or a PhD student would be applying for would be kind of a similar situation to what I went through. And, you know, similar to what Hamid said, I would, you know, I really strongly recommend, you know, coming up with questions about the organization, and especially for, you know, the USGS and maybe other agencies, it's not as transparent what the day-to-day work is and what kind of projects are being worked on, because often the websites are, you know, very out of date, and, you know, the projects are really just talked about in terms of acronyms. And so I used, you know, at the end of the interview, they asked me if I had questions, and I really used that time to try and understand, like, well, what, you know, what kind of work would I actually be doing, and what kind of projects would those really be? There weren't really any trick questions. It was a pretty straightforward interview. You know, maybe in a little bit of an embarrassing note, I did do the whole thing where you know, like, get dressed up and, like, sit down and you're, you know, ready, but you're just talking to through the phone. But I do think that helps kind of increase, you know, confidence and charisma during these kind of remote style interviews. Maybe the one kind of off the wall question that I got, because I didn't apply for like a supervisory position or anything like that, was, you know, if I had any experience, you know, guiding others through project work or research. And so, you know, kind of being prepared to talk about kind of any and all pieces of, you know, working on scientifically related projects was, you know, was something that I had kind of thought about a little bit and was prepared to do.
Great. Those are all really helpful. One thing to Joanna, I don't know if you applied both during your PhD and also your postdoc, so just curious if there were things the second round in terms of the application phase, if there was a second round that you know, were different, or you had a, you know, a new appreciation or a new perspective of.
Yeah, sure. So I only applied during my postdoc, and I had 2 interviews, and I definitely learned from the first interview. So both from the phone interview, I had 2 on-campus interviews. So in the first on-campus interview, I guess one of the things that I learned from that was yeah, so just the experience of how much of a marathon it actually is. And the whole thing on sleep is like, yes, you should definitely try to sleep as the full amount that they give you, because they don't give you much time. You know, it's the end of dinner, it's probably like 9 p.m. and then you have to be at something the next morning at 7:30 in the morning. So it doesn't give you a lot of time by yourself. But I think from that I learned, I actually learned to continue asking the same questions throughout the interview, rather than the first interview, I feel like I was asking all these questions that I had, and as I got answers, I kind of mentally checked off those questions. I was like, okay, I have the answer to this. I won't ask this anymore. And I think there's a lot of value to asking these questions to a lot of different people, because you get different perspectives, but also the people that you have meetings with at the beginning of the interview are just as important, or the people at the end of the interview are just as important as the people at the beginning. And from their perspective, it's the first time that they're seeing you and interacting with you. So still having those big, broad questions and communicating who you are in a really concise way, even if they have already seen your job talk, I think is important. And then from the actual application side, I think, you know, honestly, for both jobs, for both job interviews, I applied around the same time. And really, I think that the second phone interview went a little bit more smoothly, I think, because I knew sort of gauging the reactions of the people from the first interview, even though I was invited for on campus. I think I knew a little bit better of what to expect in terms of the questions. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we're nearing the end of time. There's just a few sort of straightforward questions that have come in. One being, how far before your desired start date do you expect to submit an application for industry or government jobs?
Man.
Go ahead, Theo.
Oh, sorry. It's a moving target with the government because the application windows are often quite short, and then it can take a really long time for those applications to move through the system. So I would say maybe don't have too many preconceived notions. You know, if it's one of these recent student or like current student positions that'll take you into a career pathway, you know, it might be, you know, 2 months or something. But for other ones, it could be longer or shorter, and there's not. So you kind of have to take those applications as they open, rather than, you know, trying to make it fit with your schedule. That's what I would say. Because who knows when the next position might open in a place that you're interested, or in a job type that you're interested in.
So in industry, it depends on the company. Usually bigger companies are flexible with the start date. So if you see an open position and you apply and then you want to start like 4 months from now, usually it is okay. Smaller groups are looking for an immediate hire. So that might be a bit harder to apply well in advance. But it doesn't hurt to apply. That's my point. Usually, if they find a very good candidate, they might be to compromise some projects, and they say, okay, we can wait a couple of months for you to join. So something within like 4 to 6 months, it's reasonable to apply. One thing to take into account, if you're international and you need like to apply for, I don't know, work permits, OPT or H visa, those are the cycles that might be outside of the jobs kind of positions available. So take those into account. And if there's something the company needs to do before a deadline, so apply well in advance so they have time to submit an application for you.
All right, so I think with that, we'll start to wrap up. This has been so helpful, I know, for me and hopefully for the attendees as well. So thank you so much to all the panelists for your really, you know, well thought out and authentic responses. I think, you know, this has definitely been a helpful experience for me. Ainsley, do you want to highlight some things about CUAHSI coming up?
Sure. Yeah. So I think this was mentioned last week, but we definitely have some deadlines coming up within the next month or so we want to make you all aware of. So we've got the snow measurement field school that looks like the deadline's in just a few days, so September 15th. And you can find all the information on that on our website. And if you have any specific questions, you can actually reach out to Emily Clark, and she'll be more than happy to help you. We have another fall Cyberseminar series coming up starting October 2nd. And again, on our website, you guys can find information on how to register for that. So it'll be similar to this Cyberseminar in that registration will be free. And then both Pathfinder Fellowship and Hydroinformatics Innovation Fellowships are, the deadlines are October 11th. And you all, if you have any specific questions on either one of those, you can reach out to John Pollock, and he'll be more than happy to help you all.
Great. And then just one last thing to highlight. You heard how great Dr. McDonald was to chat with. And so we just wanted to mention his book. We talked about it a little bit last week, but a book coming out called Navigating an Academic Career, a brief guide for PhD students, postdocs, and new faculty. And so make sure to keep an eye out for that. It's been really wonderful having you guys on the panel today. So thank you. And if anybody else has doesn't have anything else to say, we can wrap up for this week. Next week, we have 2 more cyber seminars. Sorry about that. So next Thursday and then the Thursday after. Next Thursday, we're talking about post-application negotiations. So, you know, it might seem sort of far out for some of you, but that will come, and you're going to have to navigate that pathway as well as sort of the job transition. So your new faculty position or even a new postdoc position, sort of how do you navigate that process and that experience. So we hope you'll keep tuning in, and once again, thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.